First, I want to thank Benjamin for that very kind introduction and welcome everybody. I know I'm competing with lunch here, so including for myself. So bear with us here. I also want to thank the African Studies Association and the African Studies Review for the invitation and privilege of presenting this year's ASR Distinguished Lecture. Let me begin by providing a little context to the topic that I've picked today. When I was approached about presenting this year's ASR lecture, I was engaged in a field research project in Baringo, Kenya, where I've been working intermittently over the past 35 years. I told the ASR my theme for the talk would need to closely relate to my current work, which might be a bit more ethnographic and region-specific than previous ASR lectures. However, as I worked on the paper, I realized that it touched on several important larger themes in African studies that might be of interest to a more general interdisciplinary audience, which I hope is the case. The other underlying lesson for this for younger Africanists is don't throw anything away and always have your photos and so on ready, because you'll see some rather old photos that date me quite a bit from my early work. So I've written this paper because it's going to eventually, I think, be published with revisions probably in the African Studies Review. So to keep the timing going, I'm going to predominantly read on script. So let me begin. On a recent hot Sunday morning at Marigat, Kenya, I was asked by a local chief if I would meet with the Council of Ilchamas elders in a small settlement about 12 kilometers away. At that time, the area had just come out of a 2-year drought. It was experiencing prolonged problems of violence and insecurity. As I bounced down a dirt road en route to the meeting, I prepared myself for the common but deserved community request for development assistance, especially for schools, health clinics, and roads. Upon my arrival, 5 elderly men sat on 2 wooden benches next to the chief's small office. The chief, who I've known for more than 35 years, gave a quick update of the area's 2 major problems. One problem noted was environmental, the invasion of the Prosopis juliflora plant, which has taken over many of the community's settlements in key grazing zones. The other was political, the violent attacks by a neighboring ethnic group and associated losses of valuable lands. Gesturing to the proliferation of Prosopis in the area into a nearby camp of internally displaced persons, he could easily and visually make his point. Instead of appeals for funding assistance, the elders had requested the meeting to inquire about publications and old colonial maps that could document the ethnic, so-called tribal boundaries in the area, so that they could build a legal case to recover their lands and hopefully halt further conflict. They said that they wanted to show that their larger neighbors were not abiding by the official boundaries of the colonial-imposed native reserves, in quotation marks, which at one time were a source of strong local contention in the area. In the past 15 years, the leader of the council already had been involved in 2 significant legal cases brought by the community against the government of Kenya, one associated with the introduction of the destructive Prosopis plant, and the other with political discrimination. The distinguished individual seemed aware that the Prosopis invasion and the violent attacks and associated land loss were intricately related. To place this recent encounter in historical context, it is important to note that environmental issues, especially concerns about soil erosion, overgrazing, and desertification, were fixations of British colonial officers throughout the dry areas of sub-Saharan Africa. In the colony of Kenya, Baringo was ground zero for negative depictions of environmental degradation and assumed African complicity, and for pilot schemes of environmental rehabilitation. Early accounts referred to the area as an overgrazing endpoint and an ecological emergency area. Adverse descriptions like these empower officials to intervene in local livelihoods, often through draconian measures such as population resettlement and forced labor for conservation schemes, a common theme in colonial environmental histories throughout Eastern and Southern Africa. Many of these narratives, often backed up by dubious Western science, endure into the post-colonial era. One with special relevance for this paper is desertification, The idea that human agency and mismanagement is advancing the desert across wide landscapes. Desertification is an extraordinarily difficult concept to define. What often is called man-made desertification has more to do with natural factors such as the heterogeneous nature of dry landscapes and the uneven pattern of rainfall, as well as misplaced policies. The assumed reality of desertification by national governments and international bodies spurred and continues to instigate a complex set of environmental experiments in East Africa, including using Il Chamas as a pilot desertification control site by the United Nations Environmental Program. In terms of interventions, the introduction of the invasive plant species Prosopis juliflora was the boldest and most pernicious attempt at curbing desertification in northern Kenya. One will note that the theme of Africa as a laboratory for Western science and practice has a long and tragic history, but still persists today with development experiments, biomedical testing, and I will suggest environmental experiments. This paper uses the example of a forestry project based on the introduction of Prosopis, often called mesquite in North America, to explore wider issues of significance to African studies, including the hegemony of Western science, human rights, political violence, and growing contestations over land. It will be argued that a focus on this thorny plant exposes a range of prickly political, social, and humanitarian issues that are difficult to disentangle from each other, but that need to be understood against broader struggles for political representation, resources, and cultural identity by minority and indigenous groups in Kenya and throughout Africa. By drawing on my own long-term research in the area, the paper employs ethnographic, archival, and visual materials that demonstrate the broad regional and national political ramifications of what was initially conceived as a non-political intervention at greening the environment. An unknowing witness. Let me start here by providing a very brief overview of the Chamas community, a Mau or Maasai-speaking group of about 40,000, where the Prosopis tree was introduced in the 1980s. The history and ethnography of Il Chamas are documented and detailed by David Anderson, Michael Odiambo, and myself. I will not attempt to summarize these materials here, but only to note that for a relatively small group, they have a complicated age and clan system and a long-standing dependence on government assistance for resolving inter-ethnic conflict, both colonial and post-colonial. Concerns about environmental degradation took on momentum in the post-colonial period in Kenya. As part of a national effort to combat desertification and improve the management of fuelwood, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, in partnership with the Forestry Department of Kenya, initiated the Fuelwood Afforestation Extension Project in 1982 with sites in rangeland areas of Turkana, Garissa, and Baringo counties, Kenya. Because of its ability to grow fast and withstand arid conditions, the Prosopis tree was the main species promoted. In lowland Baringo, tree planting did not begin until 1983 and 1984. The World Food Program made available food to employ about 1,000 workers on a food-for-work basis for tree planting. Unwittingly, local laborers were planting a tree that would eventually wreak havoc on their own livelihoods and the area's ecology. The planting of Prosopis at the time was not considered controversial, although there was evidence from Sudan and Ethiopia around the same time of its potential harm to environments if it spread widely. One elder who recalls the negotiations with the project in the 1980s remarked, "The people trusted the government, so we supported the project. When the government brings a project, you do not expect it to bring you harm." As a plant, Prosopis not only grows fast and tolerates arid conditions, but it also fixes deep root systems that compete for water with indigenous trees and grasses, as well as sheds leaves and pods that are unpalatable to livestock without extensive processing. Between 1984 and 1999, I visited the Il Chamas area on 6 different occasions for periods up to 4 to 5 weeks. When I first returned in summer 1984 after my dissertation, many of the pilot plots had just been planted or were in the process of being planted. For the next 3 years, the project was perceived as a success and was renewed for another 3 years in 1986. When it finally ended in 1990, about 740 hectares of prosopis had been planted in the area. Let me now briefly show a map and a few photos of the initial planting. Is this going to work? I see it, but I don't think anyone else. Okay, yeah. So this is just this is a map of Lake Baringo area and gives you a sense of where it is relative to Kenya, northwest Kenya. This is a map that was done in 2005 that just shows you around the lake area the amount of prosopis invasion in that area. Okay, and it's spread much, much more since then. This is 1984, the Food for Work program, women of course, doing the work, planting trees outside Marigat, Kenya. This is one of the pilot plots in 1984, and if you pay attention to a metal roofed cattle dip in the back, you'll see, there it is on the bottom, that's the prosopis. This second picture was taken in 2004. And as I'll discuss, I rephotoed all the different landscapes of the area. Okay. Now, okay, good. Okay, in reviewing my field notes of June 1989, little mention is made of the forestry project, except to note in Nambo, the largest settlement in El Chamas, and I quote myself, the FAO project has planted some very impressive tree areas that are fenced off. In a field visit 8 years later, however, my notes mention the spread of the plant in that, I quote, there does not seem to be much open swamp grazing now. The seasonal swamps are key elements of the pastoral ecology of the area. During that summer of 1997, I interviewed a senior El Chamas leader near his house where he remarked about the cool shade and breezes that the prosopis provides. Only 6 years later, he was one of the main initiators of the Eradicate Prosopis movement and a signatory to a lawsuit against the government, the spread of dissent. By 2000, the prosopis issue had become a concern to the community. The unprecedented El Nino floods of 1997-1998 led to a rapid spread of prosopis. My field notes from 2003 and beyond continually reference the prosopis problem. In June 2004, I write, the El Chamas, complain about nowhere to graze cattle because there is no grass due to prosopis trees. I would say that more than half of wetland grazing had been removed due to prosopis tree encroachment. In 2002, local leaders wrote a letter to the UNFAO demanding that it eradicate prosopis or they would sue them. By 2003, they bitterly complained in interviews about human infections caused by the sharp thorns, continued loss of valuable pastures, and the harmful effects to livestock from consuming its sugary pods. With the decline in President Daniel Arap Moi's power, who was from Central Baringo in the early 2000s, pending his retirement in 2002, the community was emboldened to seek justice. The government, however, was trying to dilute tensions over prosopis by publicizing its potential benefits to the community, including improved supplies of fuel wood, reduced aridity, and the greening of the area. During the first half of 2003, there were numerous meetings between the Forestry Department and the El Chamas community to seek possible solutions. To document the many visual changes in the area, I took photos in 2004, not to take photos of the prosopis landscape, it just kind of popped in. I took photos of the same landscapes and structures that I had photographed 20 plus years earlier. What was clearly evident from the photographs was the effect of prosopis on the environment. Photos taken later on in 2007, 2008, and in 2017 to 2018 show that ecological damage continued unabated. The community also had experienced massive river and lake flooding at least 4 times since 2002, with the spread of prosopis partially to blame. What had once been an open landscape with patches of acacia trees was now a mass of gnarly, bushy trees subject to damaging floods and of little utility for a livestock-based economy. As will be discussed below, the photos showing pre- and post-Prosopis landscapes were of great interest to community leaders in their legal struggles for justice. Here are the before and after photos. So this is just a landscape. Now I'm dating myself from my dissertation, 1981, a grazing area. This is the same general area, 2004. Okay, and you can tell with the mountains that it's the same area with the Prosopis. There's another 1980, and that's the swamp there in the background, which is a highly productive grazing area. Another shot of it. And there's an El Chamas herder in 1980, standing out in the wet season with his animals. And this is the same general area in 2004. And you can see a little person way in the back on a bicycle going down that road to give you a sense of how much it had overgrown. This is a shop in the little center of Nambo. This is the extreme dry season, the drought of 1980, so it is dry. And then this is the same shop. Okay, so you can see it's taken over even the business. And this is from 2004. This is not from 2018. So this is 2017, a flooded out area of roads covered by Prosopis, and this is the main road to Nambo that's been kind of encroached on 2017 by the Prosopis. Okay. Okay, we will sue. In 2003, it was ruled that FAO, as a UN organization, had diplomatic immunity and therefore could not be subject to a lawsuit. In a testimony to the government's National Environmental Management Authority, NEMA, the FAO deputy representative at the time claimed that they worked at the invitation of the Kenya government. I quote, "FAO never engages in a project that is not requested by member governments. In this case, the Prosopis project was requested by the Kenya government, and all that we did was channel the project's finances to Kenya from the Australian government." The consensus after this response was that the community had to take the government to court to resolve the Prosopis problem. By 2004, the government was increasingly aware that the community might seek legal action, and thus it began to finance studies and workshops about how the Prosopis problem could be resolved. Accusations were flying around as to who was responsible for introducing the invasive plant, with the government avoiding blame. In fact, they even went back to the 1930s, blaming some of the colonial grazing schemes. And who should be responsible for dealing with it, including any financial compensation to the community. The government, with support from FAO and other donor agencies, embarked on a multi-year initiative to identify ways to manage the tree for the benefit of the community and the environment. In 2004, the community sought legal counsel from the only El Chamas lawyer in Kenya. A formal complaint was first taken to the to NEMA, the Environmental Regulatory Agency. The goal was to demonstrate the toxic nature of the plant and its negative impacts, as well as to provide the groundwork for a legal case against the state if it became necessary. Following a lengthy deliberation, NEMA recommended that Prosopis be declared a toxic weed under the Kenya's Noxious Weeds Act and that it be eradicated. However, the government's position still was that Prosopis was bringing benefits to the area. The government did not implement the actions recommended by NEMA, leaving the community with few options but to sue. With the support of a non-government organization, NGO, the El Chamas lawyer and his firm formally brought the case against the state in early 2006. It sought several actions from the government, including acknowledgement that the government was responsible for the harm done to the community, for eradicating the plant, and for compensating the community for damages. During an interview in 2005, the senior El Chamas chief requested copies of my photos for the case, which I obliged. Later that year, I also copied the photos for another signatory to the case, in this instance, an El Chamas graduate student who was to serve as an expert witness, and there were many more photos than what I've shown. The subsequent judicial hearings became national and international news as the country's second smallest ethnic group took on a government that only 4 years earlier was forcefully led by the area's elected MP, President Moi. The prosopis issue became so hot that the National Parliament debated it for 2 days in July 2006 and declared that the government would make available 3 billion Kenya shillings, US 46 million, to rectify the problem. One BBC story at the time, British Broadcasting Company story at the time, described how, I quote, when the plant was introduced to Kenya 20 years ago, it was supposed to stop the deserts in their track. But 20 years later, it became a nightmare for residents of Kenya's drylands. Dressed in their customary red cloaks and elaborate beaded jewelry, many Ilchamas from Baringo attended the Nairobi court hearings. One day, a toothless goat was brought to court to show how consumption of prosopis pods had damaged their livestock. The national and international media were drawn to the case, especially the spectacle of a toothless day in court. One Kenyan news service stated that, I quote, standing before 3 distinguished judges in court yesterday was a toothless goat, said to be a victim of a weed gone berserk. Its owners braved a 4-hour dawn chill covering more than 300 kilometers from Baringo to Nairobi to present the unusual exhibit in court. At play in accounts like this was a tongue-in-cheek mocking of Ilchama's culture with its toothless goats and customary dress. When I asked an educated Ilchamas leader about some of the comical portrayals in the press, including editorial cartoons about the goat in court, the individual remarked, the goat in court has been good because it gives publicity to the court case. So here's just a media photo of the infamous court, the woman in the back with the toothless, and there's the headlines, toothless goat in court in case over harmful weed. Okay, in their complaint to the court, the legal team argued that the government had violated international human rights and environmental laws by denying the community the right to live in a healthy environment and by spoiling the area's biodiversity. They noted that the government had breached the international conventions on biodiversity and environment in development and that their right to a clean and healthy environment is being breached, and I'm quoting from the legal case, being breached by its unabated spread of prosopis. In the words of legal anthropologist Michael Odhiambo, the execution by the Ilchamas that linked the negative effects of prosopis on the environment to breaches of the constitutionally guaranteed rights to life and property, as well as the fundamental principles of environmental law and international conventions. To make matters even more interesting, the defense lawyers for the government took a similar tack of drawing on international protocols in their arguments. According to the defense, Kenya was a signatory to the UN framework on Convention on Climate Change in the Kyoto Protocol. They claimed that reversing desert-like conditions through the introduction of prosopis was consistent with clean development. From the government's position, prosopis can be used in a positive way to sustain development, control climate change, and reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The judges in this case were not convinced of the government's argument. On December 11, 2007, they ruled in favor of the Ilchamas community, sparking a community-wide celebration. According to the ruling, the government should be held, and I quote, accountable for the damages caused by the introduction of prosopis juliflora to the region, and immediately form a commission of experts under terms of the court to quantify the damages and costs to the Ilchamas community. It was soon apparent, however, that the court orders were not going to be implemented. The only meaningful action taken by the government was to classify prosopis in 2008 as a noxious plant, which meant that strict regulations on charcoal exports could be lifted from affected counties. The government continued to look at a range of the uses of the so-called devil bush. The findings of most studies, however, point to management of the plant as the only viable alternative, even though most Ilchamas are very skeptical about this. One elder complained, "It is very bad. It is in the swamps. The pods are very sugary and hurt our goats' teeth. This talk of management is just a small thing." Another individual explained, "We have seen the bushes grow very fast. The government says it's too expensive to eradicate, so we must learn to management. That is not possible. We need total eradication." Charcoal making and sales is a set of income-generating activities that prosopis provides. However, for many El Chamas with their pastoralist legacy, charcoal making is a culturally inferior activity, and even to this day, several families want nothing to do with it. The government to this day still makes references to how prosopis halted desertification in the area, increased vegetation cover, and provided a source of income. When questioned about these claims, one El Chamas elder explained, "We would rather live with sand than to have our livestock die from this problem. Who will speak for us?" Around the same time that major concerns about prosopis were expressed, the community also began to explore the possibility of petitioning for its own political constituency in Central Baringa. Once again, the timing coincided with the pending retirement of the former MP of Central Baringa, President Moy. The need for political representation took on a special urgency with the prosopis problem. Many individuals who I talked to talked about the prosopis controversy and the need for an MP. One individual remarked, "We have not had the MP to let the country know about our problems and to get the funds to do something about it." The El Chamas lawsuit against the government was formally filed in March 2004. The Constitution at the time allowed for a minority indigenous group to have a designated political representative, such as an MP, if it could be shown that the community is discriminated against under the current electoral system. The same El Chamas from the prosopis case was involved in this, but the lead attorney was Kenya's leading human rights lawyer. The legal team argued that the El Chamas should be granted an autonomous political constituency to elect their own MP or be designated an MP under the Constitution. Despite political pressure, the judges ruled in favor of the El Chamas petition and directed the Elected Commission of Kenya to allocate the El Chamas its own political constituency when new ones are created in the future. Once again, national and international media covered the court case with the headlines of one BBC news story noting, "Nomads win historic ruling." And here's just a couple photos from the celebration. This you can see in February 2000, the El Chamas Thanksgiving Day, and then again another photo taken in 2007. So similar to the prosopis case, this judicial ruling also was never implemented. And even when new political constituencies were created, the community was not allocated one. To quote one Kenyan journalist, "The quest for justice for the minority El Chamas community in Baringa seems to be a pipe dream, as two landmark rulings in their favor are yet to be implemented." When interviewed at his Nairobi office after positive rulings, the El Chamas lawyer lamented, "In Kenya, it is one thing to win a ruling and another to actually get something done. We won in theory, but in practice, still no commission or constituency has been formed. We are a marginal group, and no one listens to us, even when we win our cases." Beyond the Nairobi courts and legal grievances, conflict and insecurity in the Baringa region increasingly occupied the attention of the community. And these problems are not unrelated to the legal struggles of El Chamas. Livestock raiding had always been an issue in Baringa, as it is throughout the region, but it reached a new level in 2005 when 12 El Chamas were killed and more than 2,000 cattle taken in one attack. This was a tipping point for insecurity in the area. The scale of the attack was unprecedented, as was the occupation of El Chamas lands by neighbors. Many El Chamas leaders felt that it was not a coincidence that it happened soon after they bought a legal case for political representation. "Some powerful people do not want us to form our own constituency," said one community member. The prosopis problem has direct links to increased insecurity in the area. The best remaining prosopis-free pastures are now in the eastern rangelands of the area, bordering larger neighboring communities. Despite the insecurity of the border zone, it is where many herders must now move their animals to graze, which elevates the risk of attacks. I quote an interview here. "It is terrible, and we need our own representative to protect us. We need to stop the encroachment, and this will only happen if we have support of government and a representative. If we do not put a stop to the insecurity, we'll continue to lose our land, and pastoralism will be finished. But if we can have an MP, we can stop the Kalenjin Pokat from taking our areas and killing our people. We can also get action on the prosopis problem." Deadly conflicts between El Chamas and its neighbors have occurred in almost every year since 2008. And by the late 2000s, El Chamas youth were armed with weapons, mainly Kalashnikovs, AK-47s. In contrast to the past, these raids entail burning houses and schools, terrorizing women and children, and adjusting ethnic borders, a form of boundary marking through violence that Charles Tilley wrote about with regard to state-making in Europe. This form of political violence has characterized much of northern Kenya for the past 40 years, but only reached the El Chamas area in the past 10 to 15. It was at this time that I would argue Central and South Baringo became part of northern Kenya, a region less defined by geography than by weak state authority, intermittent presence of army forces, multiple parties who control violence, and the arming of local communities for defense. In this sense, what I call the AK-47 boundary line has moved markedly south than Baringo over the past 20 years. The insecurity in the area, as well as the Prosopis issue, is embedded in vicious local and national politics that leave El Chamas increasingly vulnerable. Land is in short supply and heavily contested in Kenya, and land-based conflicts have occurred throughout the country since the 1990s. Large-scale geothermal energy sources have already been found in Baringo County, and rumors of oil potential, which is currently being exploited in the border county of Turkana, make the stakes for control of land even higher. Although on the periphery of Kalenjin politics, Bokat are still part of the larger Kalenjin community, which President Moi was from, and both Kenya's Vice President, William Ruto, and Baringo's County Senator, Gideon Moi, the son of the former president, are Kalenjin with noted presidential aspirations. Despite claims to the area, they and their elected counterparts have done little to stop the land invasions and insecurity. Consequently, many El Chamas have been displaced and are now staying at an IDP camp or with relatives in the area's central and western villages. Since 2006, displaced families have been able to move back to their home every 12 to 15 months before another large-scale attack, but current displacement appears more permanent with the IDP camp already in existence for more than 1 year. Moreover, El Chamas elite have begun to move and build homes outside the area to avoid insecurity, representing a significant loss of political and investment capital for the community. And here's a shot of the IDP camp in 2017 at El Dume. Contrast that with the celebration 9 years earlier. Heightened inequality and poverty. The two legal cases have amplified the glaring inequality in the area and in Kenya generally, which has one of the highest levels of inequality on the continent. Without sufficient livestock, charcoal making has become an important income source for increasingly large numbers of poor in the area, especially widows and female household heads. Those El Chamas who have been able to attain education and acquire salaried positions outside the area, and many of the elite families have done so, are buttressed against the destruction caused by prosopis and insecurity. With increasingly large numbers of youth, especially young males outside the area, minimal numbers remain to protect against land encroachment and violent raids. Those individuals with salary jobs outside Baringo regularly remit money to family members in the rural areas and until recently often invested in the area. These revenue flows represent a significant source of survival and investment capital for the area, but are threatened by the area's problems. With decreased grazing land due to prosopis and ongoing insecurity, many educated elite are rethinking investments in the area. One wealthy individual with a senior job in Nairobi wonders if there are any good investments left in Baringo, or whether in livestock or anything else. And then there are a number of leaders that have talked about in interviews with me about the need to keep their assets in Baringo and that the big tragedy is so much investment is outside. Although many El Chamas are investing in real estate, already many El Chamas are investing in real estate in Marigat town and in neighboring Nakuru district, where land prices increased by more than 12% per year during 2012-2017. A pattern not unusual in urbanized areas of Kenya. Those elite families with land and investments outside Baringo believe economic opportunities are better and more secure. This troubling trend also exposes the widening socioeconomic gap between rural El Chamas and those living outside in or near large cities. When asked about this pattern, one elder complained to me that there are many educated in Nairobi, but the educated are not helping the community. Those people in Nairobi are disconnected from the community. This increased disconnect between rural northern Kenya and urban Kenya does not bode well for possible political gains in the future, since those urban El Chamas educated have the most political capital and connections. Thus, along with problems that have been identified, prosopis and insecurity also may be contributing to increased divisions along class and rural dimensions. Even the Nairobi-based lawyer, who was the lead attorney in both cases, has fallen out of favor with his own community. At an elaborate ceremony in 2007, he was awarded special elder status for his legal work. But in August 2016, he was publicly cursed by many of the same elders, an event that also was widely reported in the local media. It was noted that the community feels swindled by their own lawyers who took advantage of their illiteracy and sought payments from himself. One prominent elder complained to me that the system is corrupt. We had two rulings, the constituency and prosopis ruling. What happened with the money? The prosopis and political constituency cases has sparked the political ambitions of several El Chamas elite, including the El Chamas lawyer, who view the creation of a political constituency as an opportunity to be an MP. To be elected or appointed to political office in Kenya, including at the county level under the new 2010 Constitution, comes with extremely lucrative economic benefits, including exceptionally high salaries and living allowances that, according to one estimate, make elected officials in Kenya among the highest paid in the world, measured as a percentage of the country's gross domestic product. The positions also come with the capacity to reward clients and supportive communities with jobs and development projects. The competition for political office, as well as the government's waiting game over the court rulings, has diluted some of the demands for justice in both the prosopis and constituency cases. Their concern with prosopis removal by the elite and compensation is less urgent than it was 10 years ago, although the related issue of political representation remains a key issue for them since they could benefit from it. Those in the rural areas, in turn, continue to live with the hardships of prosopis, insecurity, and poverty. Conclusions. The introduction of a thorny, quick-growing plant to combat perceived desertification instigated a plethora of problems and issues that echoed and continue to reverberate well beyond the small El Chamas community. Africa is full of development and environmental experiments that disguise the politics and potential violence behind technical interventions, a point that James Ferguson made more than 25 years ago. As Peluso and Watts have shown, political interventions under the guise of green environment and conservation goals have a record of violence and dispossession around the world. In Africa, they've been associated with militaristic anti-poaching units, green land grabbing on an enormous scale, green energy projects that displace large numbers of families, and wildlife conservation areas that criminalize herders and farmers on their own customary lands. All of these symptoms are found in northern Kenya and increasingly alienate the region from the rest of the country. In the El Chamas case, the original intentions of a forestry project may not have been political, unless you think the settlement of pastoralists is a political question, because that was also underlying it. I won't go into it. But it has since been imbricated with power struggles and violence. The government's unwillingness to deal with prosopis and insecurity problems in a sustained manner reflect larger political agendas. The prosopis and related problems in El Chamas expose a national political culture where the government forms, commissions, makes promises, and judicial victories occur in state courts, but where politicians pursue personal agendas that leave communities to fend for themselves. Sounds like our current government now, by the way. The use of litigation as a strategy to gain a political voice against injustice is increasingly pursued by El Chamas and other indigenous groups in Africa and elsewhere. In Kenya alone, more than 15 indigenous groups have sought legal recourse for their own political constituencies. Odiama points out that the increasingly litigious nature of El Chamas society reflects a wider trend in the use of legal instruments by indigenous minority communities around the world. He references the Komarov's concept of lawfare
and how many indigenous groups increasingly pursue their political and economic goals by relying on courts, often with support from NGOs and activists. The use of lawfare by El Chamas as a political tactic provides a glimmer of hope and purpose for the community, although the strategy so far has failed against prevailing political and economic interests. In the Kenyan context, courtroom victories and sympathetic journalists and activists have not translated into meaningful responses for minority indigenous groups. Finally, the frequently heard narrative of Africa Rising mainly captures urban areas in this case, and as this paper suggests, highlights the increasingly wide differences between rural and urban Kenya associated with increased inequality and discontent. This is especially the case for those who have benefited little from the economic and urban growth that has taken place in Kenya, as well as in other parts of Africa. In the past, much innovative research in Africa focused on what has been called rural-urban linkages and the very strong social and economic linkages between town and country. The concept of African families with one foot in the rural sphere and one foot in the city, which described Kenya very well for much of the post-colonial period, I suggest seems less applicable today. As one salaried El Chamas worker in Nairobi boasted to me, 1 month's salary or payment from a real estate investment in town can buy the equivalent of 20 cows. So why do I need to invest in rural northern Kenya? Pushback in the form of armed banditry, violence, and political discontent from northern Kenya, as well as other dryland areas of eastern and western Africa, point to humanitarian and political stability factors for why investments and attention to these regions is warranted. Thank you.